Hi, everybody. This is Rami, like Do Re Mi, best-selling author of Living Life as an Exclamation Point. And today we're talking with Leslie Davenport. I'm really excited to talk to Leslie. She's an author, a psychotherapist, and an ordained interfaith minister, which I found interesting. She's an expert on the health impact of thought and emotions, and she has established guided imagery programs in 5 hospitals. You've seen her in Woman's Day, Family Circle, even ABC News, lots of places. I'm very excited to introduce her to you, because if you guys have been following me for a while, you know that as I help you find your passions and purpose in life, I often ask you, what are you angry about? And in my workshops, I'm still stunned at how many of you say anger, and yet that will often point you right to the direction of your passion. Today, Leslie's going to talk to us about the 5 hidden benefits of anger, not necessarily as they relate to your passions, although we may go down that road, but how they benefit you in life. Good morning, Leslie.
Good morning, Rami.
It's so good to meet you.
Oh, same here.
So tell us what's going on, what you've been up to lately.
Well, let's see. I think you might have come across this article on Huffington Post. I've been doing a series for them on ways that our thoughts, as you said, our thoughts and emotions affect our health, and ways to optimize that and get a better understanding of the impact.
Yeah. I was actually, a few people know this, I was married at one time to someone who was a rager, and we're going to talk about the difference between anger and rage as we go
Yeah.
along, but let's get into this. So anger, is it bad for our health, or is it a natural expression?
Well, I hope today we'll be able to look at some of the subtleties because, like so many aspects of human experience, it can really slide all over the place. It can be very beneficial. It can get into areas that are not as much. There's a quote by Aristotle I really like that I think captures kind of what we're after here. And he said, anybody can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way. That's not easy and not within everyone's power. And that was written a long time ago, and I think we're still figuring it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The kind of golden rule that I go by is that it's quite natural to move up and down the tone scale according to whatever situation you're in. And there are
Yeah,
situations where it's completely appropriate to be angry.
absolutely.
And yet I remember back in my 20s, I had a psychotherapist tell me, you never get angry. And being a natural born optimist, of course, I always tend to favor that side of things, and I can always find the positive. But
Yeah.
it's interesting. It was interesting to learn that it can have a healthy benefit.
Yes. Well, and one of the things that I think can be hard to sort out is sometimes we learn things. Like we learn that maybe we'll get a message from our family that it's not okay to express anger or other emotions. And so to not express anger can start to feel normal simply because we've lived that way for a couple of decades.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't necessarily our natural response if we didn't have those filters added on.
Yeah, I kind of think that people are born with the natural seed of positivity, and they learn anger. Or do you think it's just the opposite? They come in with anger from, previous lifetimes, perhaps. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, what I've come to understand as one of the most natural functional aspects of anger is that it helps us set boundaries.
Mhm.
So I think that there is an anger response when it's natural to feel a no of some kind, and often there's a wave of anger that goes with that. And I think that's natural to us, that it's inherent in us. But I don't rule out, what you're saying about things that we may bring in as well as things that we learn while we're here, which can either suppress it or sometimes overstimulate an anger response.
Yeah. So what's a criteria or two that makes it a healthy expression? One of them is a boundary, knowing where to draw a line in the sand.
Yes. I think the most important thing, similar to that Aristotle quote, is are we getting angry at the right person at the right time for the right reason? In other words, if we get stuck in anger being a response to most things in life, then it's not really being used in a discerning way. It's like that other quote that says, if all you've got is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So rather than having the full range of expressions, times that we might feel sad, discouraged, excited, sometimes people just come out with anger as almost as though it were natural to their character, but it's typically acquired. Yeah.
Having been married to somebody who rages, I can so relate to that last quote.
Yeah.
I was a nail.
Yeah.
There's probably some kind of anonymous group for that, right?
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ramey and I'm a nail.
And, to talk a little bit about that difference between anger and what can become rage, it can seem just like loud or big anger, but rage is usually something that's rooted in shame, actually, and a deep wound. And it's used typically to control, to intimidate, to try and overpower. So it's used in like a kind of abuse, obviously, a kind of verbal violence, a verbal control. Yeah.
So anger is loud and rage is louder, or is rage not always loud?
Some people, as it sounds like you may know, can really intimidate with a glance, with a posture.
Yeah.
So we communicate in many ways. I think tone of voice and volume is a common one, but it's certainly not the only one.
Yeah. When I first learned that anger has a volume to it, that was even surprising for me, and I never really thought about it until this minute of whether rage has volume or not. I just always assumed it did.
Yeah. Well, and even anger for people and often women who've grown up with a message that it's not okay to be angry, their anger sometimes comes out sideways. And so it can be something like a cold shoulder, a withdrawal, overeating. I mean, it can really show up in a lot of ways if it doesn't have its natural expression.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you mentioned that one of the themes are the hidden benefits of anger. And one of them is that it can actually buffer stress in the sense that for people, especially for women who repress an anger response, it can show up as headache, as depression. And if we learn what that healthy, appropriate flow is, it can actually be stress relieving.
Now, at one point, I heard that depression is anger turned inward. Is that right?
That is a common definition. Because I work in the realm of psychotherapy, I won't say that that's the only reason for depression. There can certainly be other causes as well. But I think that's one thing to look for when depression is present.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what are some healthy expressions for anger? Beating the pillow.
Well, I tend to think of many things, including anger and emotions, as a kind of energy. And you had referenced passion. So, for example, how we say something, if we say it with energy that is angry or similar to anger, is appropriate sometimes. For example, if I said, well, it's not okay that you say that, like that. Or if you say, it's really not okay that you say it that way, it has a different impact.
Yeah.
It has a different impact. And so there's a place that it makes room for our voice. It validates what's true for us if we use it as a way to energize our own experience. And again, I keep referencing women because I think culturally it is more prominent, although certainly there are some men that struggle with this as well. I know that sometimes we undercut ourselves. We question, is it really okay? Maybe it's all right. But we usually have an instinct there when something doesn't feel right, doesn't feel good, is violating some kind of sense of integrity. And that's when noticing kind of that energy of an angry flare is a really good clue and symbol for us to kind of check in and say, well, is that true? And really being willing to trust our own instincts about things.
Yeah, that's interesting because when you talked about undercutting and saying, oh, well, that's okay, it's appropriate for him to be angry at that situation, it's almost like we have to tune into our instincts to see if the anger is being directed at us or if it really is appropriate to that situation. And I mean, don't we get confused by that sometimes?
Oh boy. And if we are compassionate, empathetic, understanding people, we might even see, I understand that this person's anger or rage is coming from this deep wound. So it's okay. And it may be true that that's what's happening, but it's not okay that it gets blasted out at us and that we become the inappropriate recipients of that.
Yeah, I want to ask you a surprise question.
Okay.
And if you don't want to answer it, that's fine.
Okay.
It's kind of a spiritual question, so I feel like I can ask it since you're an ordained minister, and I'll be okay. But when you think in the bigger picture that we are a collection of souls on this planet, and sometimes we come into this life to help one another. That's not an unfamiliar concept, right? And so let's say, for instance, that I have a pattern of drawing in angry people.
Mm-hmm.
How would you know if it's your life's journey to help these people overcome their anger by offering compassion, or whether it's your life's journey to walk around drawing lines in the sand everywhere you go? Is that a coherent question?
Yeah, I think I know what you're after here. My approach to that is that there's something, if that's showing up in your life, there is something there for you to learn, or for whoever that is to learn. And so rather than trying to figure it out mentally and say, well, maybe I'm supposed to do this, my guidance would be to take each situation with the most compassion and integrity possible, and then let the outcome be whatever it is. In other words, if you attract relationships where a lot of anger is directed at you, I'm not so inclined to think, well, then it's your task for you to be the healer for them to play that out. Yeah. But it may be your role to speak the truth, to set healthy boundaries, to say what's so, to be loving and kind, but to set limits. And then that person is also can't help but be in the learning cycle as well. And maybe they'll step away, maybe it'll trigger their transformation, maybe it won't. But I think the important thing is to not compromise our own sense of what's most true and holds the most integrity for our body, mind, and soul in whatever the response might be. And then the pattern might shift or it might not, but we don't have to really figure that part out.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. It's not our job to heal the world. I don't know. For some people, they feel like it is their job to come in and heal the world.
And I guess what I'm saying too is that even if we set firm limits, that can be and is part of the healing. It's just the healing doesn't have to be in the sense of sacrificing our own health and well-being.
Thank you.
Process.
That's perfectly said. I often tell my people in my workshops to use their stop sign hand. And when somebody's saying something inappropriate, and if you have to block the vision so they can't see your eyes, that will often just break their train of thought, and they'll go, "Oh man, I'm being inappropriate." Of course, you can't do it once somebody's in full-blown rage. That'll never work. But But I'm suddenly thinking in the moment, besides that nonverbal cue, could I carry a little pillow around with me? Here, do you need a pillow? Can I carry a little pillow in my purse?
I think you're pointing to that there are, again, many ways of expressing ourselves. There's facial expressions, there's posture, there's leaving a room, like you said. One thing, let me just mention about rage or even very intense anger is they know in trauma studies that there's sort of this optimal level of functioning where emotions get more intense and less intense. And most of the time we're operating in that range. Rage or intense anger, if it goes above that upper line, that person loses the capacity to be rational, to engage in a useful conversation. And if you don't know that and you're trying to reason with them, it just never works. No. And so the idea is to take a break, let things come back down, then come back to a conversation.
What tips do you have for recognizing inappropriate anger? Is it always like this internal instinct feeling, or how do you spot it before it happens?
I think a key is if the anger that's coming at you is in a blaming mode, you. Then that's a clue right away. Because like any emotions, the person expressing it needs to accept some responsibility for this is how they're feeling. Even if it's about a situation that involves you. Because that same situation may or may not evoke anger in another person.
Yes.
So I think one of the important things is that in the conversation, that it's not blaming and critical and shaming, and that there's room for dialogue. So that in any good communication, if someone's expressing something, the first step is to reflect, I really get what you're saying. This is how I'm understanding it is for you. And then does that person allow room for, and here's what it's like for me? And it might be I see it a little differently, or I really appreciate you letting me know because I didn't really look at it that way. I mean, it can go a lot of different directions, but one is there room for a two-way flow? Is there reciprocity around the conversation?
And likewise, if we feel anger bubbling up in ourselves, how do we know that we're about to go too far or that we should proceed? What kind of tips do you have for that?
Mm-hmm. A lot of that, I think, is going to be an individual thing. For people who have kind of a hair trigger and they go from 0 to 60, they're going to want to learn how to kind of temper, see if there's a way to step back, consider maybe before they express it externally. For people who have a hard time showing their anger, it's sometimes helpful to just go ahead and trust saying what wants to come out and do less filtering. So again, a lot of it is this blend of what we've learned and what our temperament is, whether we need to tone down or whether we need to let loose.
Yeah. And we don't, even if we feel anger bubbling up, we don't always have to communicate it.
That's right, too.
Okay. Yeah.
That's right, too. I'm a big fan of journaling, and not in any particular style, just kind of get it out on paper.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we see it, when we look at it, it does put us in a perspective, and it can sometimes refine the anger in a way that's like, well, now I know what it really is that I want to communicate, and I can do it clearly, I can do it appropriately. Or sometimes in the process of writing out, we realize it may not even be about that person. It's something else we were carrying within us that sort of got stirred up.
It almost seems like when I feel a little bit of anger coming on that I almost need to verbalize, not to blast it, but to have a little dialogue. So I wonder, is it appropriate to also call a friend? I mean, for me, journaling, I'm not so sure that would work as well as if I called somebody and go, that creep, right?
It's great to have a friend like that, like, let me bounce this off you. I trust you. I'm curious how, what comes up for you when you hear this. Yeah, no, to have friends like that is invaluable.
Let's see, I've also sometimes, like if you can't escape, you're in a car, I'll say something like, if I wanted to be a total witch right now, here's what I'd say, and I'd go ahead and say it, and that kind of keeps it from becoming personal, and I found that to be useful in a lot of situations, actually.
Yeah, or that's great. Yeah. That's great. Or another thing I find helpful is if you're going to address kind of a sensitive topic that might be triggering as well to the other person, in a similar way, you can make a statement at the offset that helps bracket it. Like, will you dance with me on this topic for a minute? There's something really bothering me.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't blindside people if there's some degree of receptivity there.
It almost gives a little framework so it's not too scary.
Yeah.
So we can journal, we can talk to a friend, we can hopefully get some two-way communication. What else can we do to turn this into a more healthy expression?
Some of it is just to take time. We're built with such an amazing ability to process and reflect that what seems true in one moment can seem really different or have a whole different context, an hour or two later. So even just to kind of hit a pause button, go ahead and do whatever else you were going to do, and then come back and say, what is it like now? What's it feel like now? Can really give perspective. Because again, I think emotions and especially anger are energetic, to take a walk, to do anything physical, exercise, also just helps move things and can add perspective.
Now, I want to ask a question about energy. When someone is feeling angry, and if we were to consider that a low-level energy, and they wanted to bring their energy up higher, can they just like that choose a higher energy, or do you actually have to come up through several levels to come to a different place? Is it just a matter of choice?
Well, that takes me a little bit to the role of guided imagery related to anger, because you had mentioned that. And guided imagery, which is similar to visualization, is a way of going inward. And I think of it as a kind of inner listening, even more than a kind of seeing, but that varies from person to person. But one of the things I do is, in a somewhat meditative state, just a few breaths, close your eyes, I let an image form for the anger itself. And it may be the person, its situation, it may be a symbol. And then I imagine peeling it back as though there were something underneath there. And it's amazing sometimes what comes through. You had mentioned that one definition of anger is, or depression is anger turned inward. And sometimes there's things under anger that are, for some people, harder to feel, like sadness, like a deep kind of grief, like realizing the anger is getting bigger because it has to do with an older pain or an older wound. And that idea of peeling it away and getting to a deeper level is at the same time elevating, because it starts to hold it in a much larger perspective. It brings much more spaciousness around it. Does that make sense?
Can you give us an example?
I'm thinking of someone in a psychotherapy session where I guided them through an imagery process like this. I'm trying to remember what they were mad about. I think it might have been a relationship issue. Yeah. But in the peeling back process, in the way I described, they had an image of themselves as a young child, kind of huddled in a corner, and recognized that what had been happening in the interaction that they found so upsetting was kind of a replay of what they had experienced from their parents. And so while the current situation had something that needed to be addressed, it was this kind of angry outburst was putting them in kind of a child place, a child emotional place, that didn't give them the full range of who they were to address the situation in a more mature way. So as they recognized that, and then through the imagery, helped that young child get what it needed: protection, support, understanding, and that eased up, then they were able to address the current situation in a much more direct way.
Now, if you have something that's making you angry right now, let's say it's a work situation, a boss or a coworker, something like that, or a client, and you're really wrapped up in this little knot, and you go in to do this guided imagery yourself, or even to do the journaling yourself, how do you keep from, let's see, what's the question? How do you not stay tied up in the knot? How do you begin to pull that apart? Are you looking for some kind of peace? Are you looking for, here's what I really want? Are you looking for some kind of self-validation?
Okay. Boy, it's a big question.
I know. How do you just not stay right in that anger,
Well, let me start with one piece of it, and then let me know if I'm not getting to everything.
Okay.
It's actually reminding me of a teaching story I want to mention briefly, where this student and teacher go up to a mountaintop, and up there at the top of the mountain, the teacher takes a scoop full of salt, puts it into a glass of water, stirs it around, and asks the student to taste the water. So he tastes it, and it's very bitter and undrinkable, and he says, it's awful. So the teacher takes the same amount of salt, 1 heaping tablespoon, and puts it in the mountain lake and stirs it and scoops up a glass of that water and asks the student to taste it. And he says, well, it's sweet. It's wonderful. I don't even notice the salt. And the teacher points out that the salt was the same amount, and that what made the difference was the glass or the lake. And the analogies there is that the salt is like our suffering or our anger. If our framework is really tight and small and we're kind of running around on a little hamster wheel, it's very hard to do much other than kind of feed that. But if we do it with imagery or meditation, we're opening up the perspective by which we can look or experience the salt. So we bring in perhaps understanding or compassion or other aspects to the situation that we had been blocking out. And it gives us more internal and external resources about what's needed there. So that's the reason why working with meditation or imagery or even something creative like painting or writing can help expand the framework from which we're looking at it. And I'm a real big believer in the serenity prayer, meaning that, is the situation at work something where an actual change is possible? Or is it a matter of needing to somehow accept it, come to terms with it in a way that's more workable? And can we sort that out? And if something can change, how can we be courageous and clear about saying or doing something that would really support that, and not even sabotage ourselves if we come at it, without a more thoughtful, mindful approach.
Yeah. Now, I have another question for you.
Okay, great.
I'm coming up with all these little jewels, at least in my own head. As a psychotherapist and an ordained minister, what's your perspective about drawing a picture in your mind of how you want the situation to be instead of trying to work through the problem and only focusing on what you want to create?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The psychotherapist in you may ridge up, and the minister in you may go, great idea.
Well, that's why for me, those two really work beautifully together. I consider them sort of on a very fluid spectrum. That, again, how we're assembled, we'll say things like body, mind, emotion, spirit, as though they were separate chunks of us, and they're so interconnected. So for me, if I can bring, kind of like the story I was telling, a spiritual or expansive context to what might be a psychological struggle, it only adds. It certainly doesn't have to be an either or. And so my answer is kind of a both and kind of thing. There is a danger that has sometimes been called spiritual bypassing, that if something is difficult to deal with or too painful, sometimes we leap over it and just do oh, well, life is beautiful. And it's actually a type of avoidance.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if we don't add that spiritual perspective, it's a little like the hamster wheel I was talking about, and we don't see a more creative, soulful way of a resolution. Yeah. So I really am in favor of bringing them both together, including envisioning what would it look like if this resolved. I may not quite know how to do it yet, but let's look at that future where there could be a more harmonious way of relating, or a more a setting that holds more integrity for me.
Mm-hmm. I love your advice on that. I've actually seen people like that who are so into let go and let God, it's like they don't even have a hold of their own lives.
Right.
And I didn't know there was a name for it, spiritual bypassing. I love that.
Yeah. And I like to think of it too, that God gave us our wonderful brains and our wonderful emotions and our wonderful bodies. So to use the capacities within all those arenas is part of the spiritual realm, as well as the more ethereal parts we've been referring to.
Yes, I think we're here to evolve. We're not here to go all day long. Well, very good. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I guess just to also recognize that anger has been through history a very wonderful catalyst for change. Mm-hmm. Some of the most well-known examples, whether it's, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, who've created an organization out of a kind of justifiable anger. Yeah. Or civil rights movements, women's movements. And again, a lot of these have not so healthy examples of anger, but many of them have, how can we use that passion, that energy, that sense of what's right, a kind of true righteousness, in the best sense of the word, has been positively fueled by some of the energy of anger.
Well, true righteousness is, I think, a great example of using anger to find your own truth. How often are we not honest with ourselves about what we want or what we want to create? We get these layers of fog built over our heart of what we really want. So I think if you can be angry in a healthy way, you can help get at your own truth sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you ever have people come into your office and just scream and really let loose, and you go, congratulations, you just found your truth.
I love to see that again, especially if it's not a mode of expression that those folks have had available to them.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful blossoming, actually. Yeah.
It's funny I bring it up because so many people say, oh, I don't want to go into a shrink's office and beat a pillow. I mean, that's so stupid. So you have a book handy, and tell us about your website there and how we can find out more about you.
Sure. Here's the book. It's Healing and Transformation Through Self-Guided Imagery. And it really is a how to do the guided imagery that we've been talking about. It teaches you how to tune into yourself, how to invite images to form, how to explore them, how to find what the messages are that are coming back to you. And also my website, which is my name. It's Leslie Davenport, LesliDavenport.com, has several free MP3s where you just click and play and get a little taste of what imagery is. If you like it, you can also download it onto any kind of MP3 player. And there's quite a number of free articles as well, including one on befriending anger.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Now, I want to ask you a quick question because, and this is just off the cuff, so, sometimes I have people come through my workshops and they can't quite get a handle of what their passion or purpose is, and they've been searching for it for maybe years sometimes. Do you have a way through guided imagery to help people find those images that they can't even get?
Yes. Yeah. There's several inroads. One that comes to mind is ways of going back in our life when we felt a time of being filled with joy, filled with excitement, filled with that sense of possibility, even if we were a little kid, and to go back and revisit that energy. And then once that energy is kind of flowing in us, we can bring that with us back to present time and see then what wants to arise with that same sense of enthusiasm, having released some of those blocks and filters that we end up layering on top of ourselves. That's one way. There's several.
Yeah. And then with your own private clients, do you voice dialogue through that? Or do you just...
Very much so. Yeah. Yes, it's helping people allow those images to arise from within them, letting the images have a voice. What's it like to hear that? How do they want to respond? How can they embody it? Yeah. How can they stay connected through it as they go into day-to-day life? Very much so.
Awesome. That's awesome. Every once in a while, I bump into someone who, like me, has a very strong male energy. And I don't know if it's just this need for control or what happens, but once in a while I get someone who just can't get their head around, what that thing is. So it's good to know. So LeslieDavenport.com.
Yep.
And your book is available there.
Yes, it is.
Cool.
Yep.
All right, very good. I very much enjoyed our little therapy session today.
Thank you. Me too.
And we're going to end the call here, but stay on the line for me, okay? Thank you.